hundreds and hundreds of drones sent towards Moscow, but they were all shot down. And, we're talking about not a direct hit, but just some debris from a drone that was shot down over Moscow. Most of them were shot down, well before they reached Moscow. I think it was clearly an effort to, let's say, rain on the parade. It was an effort to scare away world leaders, that had promised to attend, but it failed. I think it's very silly. It's petty, but very typical of Zelensky and his people. We see these things all the time. I mean, they're really kind of petty actions, based on public relations, really public relations that maybe have their desired effect within Ukraine and probably within at least a part of the West, but have the opposite of the desired effect everywhere else. This is not something that's going to convince people, say, oh, wow, these, Ukrainians we got to take them seriously, or no, it's going to solidify actually the suspicions that they had about Ukraine as being unreasonable, reckless, and, just completely out of control. So I think Zelensky just hates the idea of a successful celebration taking place in the Kremlin, with world leaders attending. Again, let's not forget, this is the guy that has a picture of the Kremlin in flames, right outside of his office. And so this is the opposite of the Kremlin in flames. This is the Kremlin celebrating a great triumph.
But didn't they celebrate Victory Day? I mean, the majority of Ukrainians?
They were part of that victory. Of course, they were a very important part of the Soviet Union, and many of the greatest battles were fought on Ukrainian soil. So it is rather odd. Again, as many people have pointed out, this wasn't just Russia, but it was all the Soviet Union, and a Soviet Union allied, of course, with Western powers, with the U.S. and Britain. But there has been a kind of a rewriting of history, a downplaying of the Soviet contribution. And of course, in Ukraine, there's the cult of Bandera that has been fostered and that has grown and has really taken over the country, is really the dominant ideology. And that is very much, anti-Soviet. And the Banderites, Bandera's people fought the Red Army, in close alliance with the Wehrmacht.
But they didn't make up the majority of the Ukrainians. The majority of Ukrainians fought for the Red Army?
Oh, yeah, no question about it. Right. No question about it.
It's wild then, right? That we are supporting, are we supposed to start celebrating Nazi victories?
Yeah, you kind of wonder what's happening here. Yeah, we're not there yet. Well, I think we are there in Ukraine, essentially. I mean, or we're getting there. The Banderites are very, very, they have their own version of history, and they've, at least for public consumption by the Western public, they've downplayed or denied the atrocities that Stefan Bandera and his people committed. But among themselves, they know quite well. And they also, many of them, especially in certain military units, openly display, swastikas and other symbols of the Third Reich. So among the extreme members, there is no effort to hide the association between Bandera and the Nazis. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the West is aware of this as well, right? They just try to hide it. But do you think there's some type of icky feeling? I mean, they're always invoking World War II and how this is the most holy of all wars and Winston Churchill, but then we are rewriting history, like you said, or just conveniently ignoring the vast majority of the contributions that led to the defeat of Hitler, and instead we are propping up what is a regime that idolizes Nazi collaborators, the Banderites.
Yeah, we are, and it's you wonder how much of it's conscious, how much of it is meaning that the supporters of Zelensky and his regime, how much of them are conscious of this, or aware of this, I should say. How many of them are just thinking of this as tactical? For the time being, because the greater evil is Russia. We just can't really look at or cast a light on this phenomenon because it hurts our cause. But when it's over, we'll take care of these guys. Maybe some of them are thinking that way. But you wonder, or it's just that there really is starting to be some sort of change in historical understanding. It's not just, of course, in Ukraine, but you also see it, for example, in the Baltic states, because the Baltic states had similar movements, similar to Stefan Bandera's movement, and many of them were very, very eager allies of Hitler's armies.
I'm just wondering if you're a Ukrainian in, let's say, pre-2014, were there normal, huge, big celebrations for Victory Day prior to that in Ukraine, in Kiev? Everybody knew that this was a huge event. So many Ukrainians lost their lives in World War II, and the Red Army is the one responsible for defeating the Third Reich, and they have to have some type of pride, just like they do in Moscow, right? There were these types of celebrations prior to 2014.
No, they certainly were. I don't know how big they were. I just don't know how big they were.
But definitely it was in the consciousness of the average Ukrainian, and they knew their contribution. I just wonder how weird it would be for them to all of a sudden like, oh, we're switching sides, guys. Remember how we always used to celebrate our victory over the Germans? Well, now we don't like that. We're on the German side now. That's basically what's happened, right? That's just insane to think about, like in the United States, and just tell everybody, hey guys, we always used to celebrate about how we did such a great job, but really, we like the Germans more now. We like the Nazis now. That's pretty much what's happened, right?
Well, yeah, maybe not quite like that, but very close. I mean, that seems to be where we're heading. And yeah, you can say among certain people, yeah, that's true.
It's got to be blowing. I mean, people in Ukraine have to understand then, right? I mean, the majority, other than the people that subscribe to this Banderite ideology.
Right. It's hard to say. I don't know what the average Ukrainian is thinking. I think it's very clear what they were thinking, like certainly prior to 2014. But probably also prior to 2022. But since especially, 2014 when the coup was launched and Yanukovych was overthrown, and then 2022, of course, we're talking about the launch of the special military operation. Both those times, the anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, and then pro-Bandera ideology got ratcheted up. And it became increasingly difficult for people to express their viewpoints. At this point, I think the average person, he may be, it probably is very troubled by what's going on, but just doesn't dare to go out and or openly express, what he knows to be a prohibited viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Right. Putin has laid out one of his goals is denazification. Those of us that have been, probably most of our listeners understand what that means. It's talking about the Banderites within the Kiev regime. But I wonder if if Russia's starting to view a lot of the Western elites as part of this neo-Nazi element, this Nazi element as well. They're saying, well, they're the ones that are supporting the Nazification of Ukraine, if we want to use that term, the Banderism of Ukraine. So do they start to view people like Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen as essentially Banderites themselves, that this is part of the Nazi problem, the denazification issue?
Yeah. Certainly some of them are saying that. Like Medvedev is a good example. I mean, he often suggests that. And even the foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, they have been pointing this out. And, it's hard to say. I don't really know what's going on in these people's minds, but you start to wonder over time, is there a real now kind of realignment? I don't see these people openly, aligning themselves or adopting, let's say, a fascist ideology. It's still so much part of their language that they're anti-fascist or anti-Nazi to the very core of their being. Let's not forget, in places like Germany, you get arrested for making the wrong kind of salute, and a political party is banned for, well, not even for being in any way, sympathetic to the Nazis, but for, let's say, being immigration restrictionist, because the Nazis were that too. That's the kind of reasoning. So there is this very extreme, anti-Nazi rhetoric that you find there. But at the same time, the one place where there are, you could say, maybe not real Nazis, but descendants of these Nazis, of a group that was very, very closely allied to them, and who make the association themselves, as I say, especially those in, the more extreme members, don't deny the association at all. The one place where it's real, and, the people have guns and openly talk about their ethnic hatred. Again, I think it's like, when we think about Hitler's people, we think about the persecution of the Jews, and that's mainly what we think about in the West. But a lot of it was anti-Slavic, and that's the part that we forget about it. And when you look at the band rights, it's often pointed out, well, Zelensky himself is Jewish or half Jewish or whatever. So how could they be? You say, yeah, you do actually get anti-Semitic rhetoric from them, but the focus, it's just so obvious to me, is on hatred of Russians. It's that they're obsessed with it. It's like, it's what they are, what defines them more than anything. It's hating Russians, and they talk openly about this. Zelensky himself, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, said that he just hated Russians. We're not talking about Russian soldiers or the Russian leadership, but Russians. And again, a lot of his people, better than 20%, are clearly ethnic Russians. And then, about half of them are Russian speaking, including himself, and have obviously very, very close ties. And then the other part, the ones who really are, you could call Ukrainian speakers, and in the West, their language, their history is very much entangled with Russia, but they've chosen to make this really the center of their ideology. It's just this hatred of Russia. But again, it's like, well, how can the Europeans be okay with this, you would think? You say, okay, maybe they're not exactly Nazis, but this is part of what if you look at the European the EU constitution, the founding documents and everything, so much is about protecting persecuted minorities, and as opposed to these ultra, nationalisms, the chauvinism that would suppress other languages and other ethnic groups. And, that's what they're about. And yet the Europeans kind of just shrug and look the other way. And they've been doing that for a while. And didn't just start a couple of years ago. It's like you would get murmurings of criticisms both in the U.S. and in Europe in the years leading up to the SMO. But they were just murmurings. And just in general, it's just, they let it go. But again, you could say the same thing about Palestine. Say, well, this is so obviously a case. This is what you say you are opposed to with a very fiber of your being. This is what you're supposed to be, kind of like an anti-ethno-supremacist entity, right? That's what the EU is supposed to be. And yet here it is, and now it's taking a real extreme form in Israel, and you just have nothing to say. Well, you have the occasional murmuring, the wringing of hands, but you just keep on sending them arms. And, so what's going on with Europe? Is it that they actually, you have to conclude that this facade of, and, we'll just say of liberal cosmopolitan values it's just that, it's a facade, and that something else, far uglier is taking its place. These close alliances, or these very, very emotional and deep connections that they've established with, both the the state of Israel and with the Ukrainians is fundamentally in conflict with the ideology that they espouse. And so, especially as this goes forward and as both of these regimes become, more and more extreme, yeah, I think it's hard to see how Europe isn't being pulled into the abyss with them. And the U.S. too, to the extent that it has tied itself. Again, the U.S. is in particular Israel. It's I think it's really a battle over the soul of the West, and it's right now it looks like the forces of darkness are winning. I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Yeah, it's true. There's two choices, two paths we can take. One is we can start to sink down into the abyss with them, which is what's happening. We start to justify the genocide in Palestine. We start to justify the fact that we have this true Nazi collaborator banderism element in Ukraine. Or you have to acknowledge it. But to acknowledge that this is true is just so horrible that you can't face that truth. So they really put themselves in a bind. The West, the U.S. can't go around and say, oops, yeah, we were helping Israel commit this genocide. And the Europeans and the United States as well can't say justify like, oh, we really have a problem with the regime here because they are clearly Nazis. They're neo-Nazis here. And you can't say that because your whole identity has been against these things. Can never have anything like, of course, a genocide. We would never be part of that. We're all about never allowing that to happen before. Like you said, using this language of inclusiveness and just protecting minorities. That's what we're all about. And then you have this here in Ukraine. So you just can't admit that. So they're in a tough spot. So I guess we're just going to slip into the abyss. But more as we become the monster that we say that we're always trying to protect the world from, the people that live in those countries will realize that, and the people are going to wake up and like, hey, wait a second, the hypocrisy is laid bare, right?
Yeah, well, we certainly hope so. It's not over. I mean, there is opposition. It's muted, in both Europe and America, but there is opposition to the current trend. We'll see.
Yeah, I think. The biggest problem that we have is that people get very deeply ingrained beliefs when it comes to Israel and people now with Ukraine and Russia. And how do you break such an ingrained belief? That's the hard part, right? It's just it becomes their identity. So
yeah,
can you break that? How does it happen?
Well, it obviously does happen, but it's difficult. You make an emotional investment in somebody or a group of people, and you decided this person is the victim, and if this person is the victim, then you don't want to hear anything that suggests otherwise, because that would be blaming the victim. That's a very powerful kind of emotion. I think maybe all of us have experienced it at some point, because it's natural. If somebody really is a victim, then it's a horrible thing to do. Somebody slanders the victim and you're just that's almost the very definition of the evil, and you don't want to be part of that. So I think what you find is people who are emotionally invested in Israel and Zionism, and people who are emotionally invested in the Kiev regime have this belief. And when they occasionally hear things which very strongly contradict it, just massively contradict it. But they respond, not by looking, okay, wait a second, I need to look at this. I need to examine this, maybe re-examine my assumptions. Perhaps I got this wrong. But it's the emotions take over. And they say, I can't listen to this. This is just more proof that the other side is evil. And not only are they, doing these terrible things, they're slandering the victim, and I'm not going to be a party to it. So you choose a side, and then you get pulled in deeper and deeper. Obviously people do come out of it, and sometimes it just, it's the accumulation of evidence over time, or a particularly maybe jarring incident, something that, sometimes it's just like, okay, you heard these things, but you could always discount it. That's just Russian propaganda. That's just the crazy leftist talking in some crazy Palestinian leftists or something. I mean, they always say this stuff. I'm not, of course they're going to say that stuff. I'm not going to listen. But then something happens. One example, of course, would be in Palestine would be that those medical personnel that were just outright murdered by the IDF. The IDF lied about it, attempted to bury, the ambulances. And I would assume that at least some people at that point, because that actually broke through and made it into mainstream media, even if they tried to give it a certain spin. You just have to stop and give you pause. And I think things like that, that's just one incident, can cause somebody to finally, something that the shock of something like that can overcome the emotions, the emotional investment you made, and perhaps send somebody on to step back and say, okay, I really do need to reassess this. But I think it has to be something very, very shocking like that. And most people just ignore it. They don't even want to look at that. I don't, or they find amazing rationalizations, that there will be further proof, because the IDF says they're investigating it. That shows that they're just so civilized. They had a few bad apples. Of course, they didn't really investigate it, and it was, the whole thing was whitewashed, and nothing came of it. But yeah, that's all I can say. It just it's a very, very powerful force. This kind of emotional attachment to one side in a conflict. And it is not easily overcome. And it tends to, let's say, just shut down one's reasoning powers. So you feel like you're obligated to believe. You don't want to question, because questioning is wrong. You need to stand by the righteous party, the victim, or whatever. And so you just stop thinking. But sometimes it's just something hits you so hard in the face that you're forced to wake up. And that's all. And I think we've actually been seeing that, over the last couple of years. But it's, it hasn't reached a critical mass. It's happening on the edges. Opinions are changing, in both conflicts, in favor of, of the Russians and of the Palestinians.